The going live part is always the part where if it works, I get very excited. Crystal, let me know. I think it is live on Facebook.
You are
okay,
live.
Live on Facebook.
Have fun.
And it's right around time. Thank you. 2 minutes before, I'll open up the chat. I'll make sure that I've got gallery view so I can see both of our leads for today. Okay, here we go. There's just a few more people I haven't had a chance to see. Debbie's here. Debbie wants to know about the whole child or the whole child virtual summit that just finished. Reach out to me, Debbie. I'll give you some information there. John@characterstrong.com. Teresa loved the whole child summit. If you love the whole child summit, then you're in for a lot more of that right now in terms of value adds and content. Jessica from England.
Yes.
Wow. Snailwell, England. That is exciting. Chris Weber is here today. Moon Culp is here. Lori from Kennewick. This is very exciting. So we have people from all over. And we want to make sure, in case people are coming on last minute, that we respect the start time here. Kennewick is definitely been digging into this work a lot recently. Love seeing so many from the Kennewick School District, both classroom teachers, administrators, paraeducators here today. This is exciting. So a couple things. One, feel free to be putting questions into the feature that you have at the bottom of the webinar there, and we will be, I'll be moderating today. My name's John Norland, one of the co-founders of Character Strong. Grateful that you have attended. We have about 150 live with us right now, many more that have registered. So my guess is that number will continue. And then there's some that prefer to watch it on Facebook Live. So we'll have a team of people that are looking in both of those areas and then putting questions into a document that I have. And so as our two guests today that I'll introduce, and then I'll let them introduce even more, share, then I'll put questions in front of them because this is going to be an incredibly important topic. And I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Lori Linus and Dr. Bella Bukowski. Did I say that correctly when we talked?
You got it.
Yay. Who, I'll just say this, and then I'll let them talk more specifically. This is a huge highlight for me to have them both with us today and sharing their wisdom and their passion. They are well known in the space that they're presenting on today for many, many years. And I have been following their work for many, many years and am grateful for the work that they do. And when our schools that we work with at Character Strong, where we really focus on strengthening that tier one, when we start to get that happening, and then when the next natural step is how do we get more intentional? How do we really start digging into this work? Today is all for you. This is going to be digging in deeper of how do we really start moving the wall forward to impact our students, our staff, our families. And so I'm grateful for them being here today, giving of their time because they have very busy schedules, and we'll make sure that you know how to connect with them after today's, but I'm going to turn it over because I know there's a lot of content and I'll let you take it from here. And then I am going to be taking my own notes. And if you say a resource, I'm going to be writing it down because there's always these questions up front. Are we going to get the resources afterwards? Yes, we'll send you the PDF. We'll send you resources that are mentioned as a follow-up for registering for today's webinar. So grateful. Thank you for being here. I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, John. My name is Bella, and I'm going to be really brief with my intro because I was on a webinar last week and it was only an hour long, and they spent about the first 10 to 15 minutes with introducing and thanks and all of that, and we only have an hour. So if you want to know more about me, my website's here, but I do lots of work within our state, within Montana, California, all under the umbrella of MTSS, trauma-informed practices, restorative practices, PBIS, social emotional learning, mental health, lots of work helping districts do program evaluation, coaching, training. I also have a private practice in Seattle. I'm a clinician where I see about 20 kids per week and their families to help support that mental health lens as well. So that's brief. If you want more, just go to my website. Lori, take it away.
All right, I'll be brief too. Lori Linus with Sound Supports. I stopped counting last year when we passed 1,000 schools that we've worked with. So we've worked with a lot of schools, you know, from pre-K through. high school, over 100 school districts. So, doing this work with MTSS is something that we love and value. And it's so exciting to be able to do this and see the blend with Character Strong. My husband, who's out teaching in the shop right now, because that's where his classroom is set up, is also teaches at a Character Strong school. So it's really great to see this and be able to be here with you today.
That's great. When you get to 1,000 schools, you get to stop counting. That's
Yeah,
what I was
yes.
So just jumping on in our agenda and learning targets, we've got an hour, so we're just going to dive in and dig deep. And anyone that knows me knows that that's what I do the best, is just getting straight to the point. I'm an East Coaster. We're going to briefly talk through MTSS, review guidance for mental health through multi-tiered system of support lens. We're going to briefly define, when we decided to do this in an hour, I was like, oh gosh, how are we going to do this in an hour when this is typically several days of training? But we tried to pull out the most important snippets for you. And beyond today, you just reach out if you need more. You just let us know. And then we're gonna finish with just some quick classroom practices at Tier 1 and Tier 2 to really focus in on the mental health challenges. So just some norms quick, whatever taking care of yourself means this morning, do it. I'm standing, maybe you need to stretch. I often do that on these. Whatever engaging fully means for you, but really being mindful of others. If you're not on mute, if you'll go ahead and put yourself on mute. John already mentioned it. If you wanna speak, just raise your hand or pop something in the chat box. So we wanna make sure that you are able to get those thoughts out and then ask questions as they come up. And we've got someone moderating the box. So we'll be able to get to those questions. Okay, I heard there was someone in England, so I'm just going to talk about the US, but I suppose we could also talk about the UK at some point as well. But we know in the US, there's more than 50 million public schools. And we know that as many as 1 in 5 students show signs of a mental health disorder. So there was a really great report that came out from the CDC in November 2019. We can get you that report that talks more in depth of these statistics, around these statistics. We can definitely get that to you. That's where this is pulled from. We also know that by the time these students reach the 7th grade, 40% of students will have experienced some sort of mental health problem. I will say in my practice, I've been in practice for about, I don't know, 8 years, 9 years. And when I first started my practice, there was so many kids coming in with a diagnosis of ADHD and that I was diagnosing, among other things. And I will say in the last 4 years, the diagnoses coming in and the diagnoses that I'm seeing and giving are predominantly anxiety and depression. And that aligns directly with the research that's coming out around the reasons why in social media and the way that our nation is changing and has changed. And we know that now, I've been coaching schools through this pandemic, and we know this is even more of an issue for kids that are even at the lower level experiencing anxiety, experiencing isolation, experience depression. This is only going to amplify it. And so I've just been doing so much coaching with schools, and I know Lori has too, around how do we still support. None of our schools in Washington are in session for the rest of the school year, and we're not even sure about the beginning of the school year next year. So my plug has been really coaching and pushing schools. How are we still supporting? And how are we reaching not only the students that maybe we have identified already before school ended, but those students who maybe weren't coming up, bubbling up, but maybe are now because of everything that's been going on. So again, from that report from the CDC, when we look at kids aged 10 to 14, over a 10-year span, we're looking at suicides that have taken place. We have seen an increase of 56% in that 10-year time span, kids aged 10 to 14. And then if you look at young adults, teenagers, young adults aged 15 to 19 in that same 10-year span, we've seen numbers that have tripled when it comes to suicide. We know that there are increasing reasons why. And I can't even go into all of them because we only have an hour. We know that this is happening. We know that kids are suffering. We know that families are suffering. And I am most passionate about how do we get in. Yes, academics are important, but from my perspective and my lens, even more important. And I know John and I know Lori feel the same, even more important. How do we get at the social emotional needs and the mental health needs of these students so they can access? And when you look at these statistics, it's even more of a reason to really be pushing and plugging for that foundational piece of social emotional learning. So just a slide for you to take a look at. 50% of all lifetime cases of mental illness begin by age 14, 75% by age 24. These are our kids. These are the kids that are walking through our doors every single day. And those numbers are astounding. And if we are not focusing on how do we address this, right, we are missing huge opportunity to not just affect our kids in schools, but to affect our kids beyond school, to affect our communities, to affect our families, to affect our society. Really thinking about, one of the biggest things with this work that I know John and I know Lori experience as well is when we look at all these statistics, I'm not going to go through all of these, but when we look at these statistics, it is so important not just to share these statistics because they're important with our families and really know what our kids are going through. It is so important to help the educators, the adults in our buildings truly understand what this means for them as kids are showing up and they're trying to teach these students. That's a whole nother 2-day presentation. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but it has to be mentioned that we know childhood trauma absolutely affects health across a lifetime in several different domains. And absolutely thinking about students who are showing up with mental health challenges, there is a strong correlation to trauma and adverse events that they have experienced in their lifetime as well. Again, a whole nother 2-day training. So what is a mental health disorder? I saw someone's hand raise. Should I call on that or should I just keep going, John?
No, I think you're okay because in the webinar feature, unlike meetings, the number one way if people are wanting, they could just put the question in the chat and then we have a whole team that's pulling them over into a document and then I'll put them in front of you as needed.
Okay, don't want you to think I'm ignoring you. I'm just rolling. I just happened to see that hand raise. So in brief, a mental health disorder is a condition that disrupts a person's mood, thought, and or behavior consistently for a period of time. If I'm doing a full day training on this, I'm diving deep with you on where the consistency over time comes from, but I'm not. So I'll just briefly let you know, we have lots of tools in the clinical world that we use that really helps us to assess and really lays out what consistently means. And there's different criteria and different things that we look at. But when we think of mental health disorders, here are some of the ones that you have seen and heard about in your roles, the different roles that you have within your schools. I'm going to talk through in a little bit some of the biggest ones that we see that show up in education. But before I do that, I've already mentioned this once, but I'll say it again. We know that when we're struggling as adults, last night, I have a 3-year-old. That's my other job. I have a 3-year-old, and I was really tired because I was on Zooms all day yesterday. Even as an adult, it was very hard for me. My mental capacity was not there. It was hard for me to be a good mother last night. And I could feel my patience just on edge. And so I had to have my husband take over. I have the cognitive awareness and abilities and mental health to be able to recognize and know that. Kids that are coming into schools that are struggling and on that same edge, they don't have the cognitive abilities and they don't have the skills oftentimes to be able to know how to navigate that. So we know that the last thing that they're going to want to focus on is learning. It's going to be much harder for them. We know that of the nearly 5 million affected students, 80%, and every time I see this statistic, it floors me, 80% will never receive treatment, which my plug, I didn't say this, but I was a former school counselor. When I look at that statistic, how can it not be our job in schools to serve these students? How can that not be the #1 role and goal of educators when we see these statistics. It has to be. And we know that in every school, there's people on the ground that can play a big role in identifying who these kids are and how we can help support them. We also know time, resources, capacity, training, and biggest is systems. There's no systems in place, and that's what we're talking with you about today. When I look at this list that I have on here, state, federal, learning entities, school districts, psychologists, counselors, nurses, every single person on this list has such an important role in helping to bolster the mental health of our students. How do we do this systematically though in a building? Because typically it's a counselor that a kid is sent to, and no one else really knows what's going on. No one else is actually helping to support. It's one person. And John and Lori and I are all preachers of this idea of tier 1 universal supports. And what does that mean? How are we all helping to serve kids? And every single person on this list has a role in helping to do that. So really thinking about and imagining if all these roles could work together and creating a sustainable system where no kids are lost. There's no gaps. We are catching kids as they're coming in. And what does that look like at tier 1, at tier 2, and at tier 3? And we're going to briefly touch on that this afternoon. We also know the challenge is mental health is one of the last things we focus on, not even just in schools, in society in general. It's one of the last things that we focus on. And too often it ends up not being anybody's job. Mm-hmm. Something that I've been able to do with a handful of the school districts that I work with is I've been able to really focus in with their teams or their counselors for the district and really helping to know what are the foundational pieces without being a mental health clinician. What are the foundational pieces and evidence-based practices that you can run in schools? What groups can you run that are evidence-based to really get into and hone into that mental health piece? All right, Dr. Linus.
Yes. All right. So we can just jump into the next slide. When we think about how we can make all these pieces work together, right? If you're on and you're already working and implementing Character Strong, you've put in and invested time in that social emotional learning in that piece. You might also be doing a system like PBIS, your positive behavior supports. You may be doing restorative justice. Then you've got these mental health counselors coming in, these outside agencies. This notion of the multi-tiered systems of support is how do we get all of those things working together into one comprehensive framework, right? So our goal is that we're bringing together all the different interventions and supports we want to do for kids, and also putting in this lens of everything we're doing at that higher intervention level, we have to think about how do we go back to that prevention level. So we'll talk through that. If you'll forward to the next slide. And it is this balancing act. We were doing a presentation last week for the MTSS Fest in Washington, if some of you were on that, and about how we do reentry. In fact, we'll be doing another webinar focusing on school reentry after this break from COVID-19, and people were saying, well, how much time should I be giving to the social emotional learning? Because we're going to have to get in and make up all this academic time, right? It is going to be this balance, but I also want to say it's so much more important now than ever that we're focusing on that social emotional learning development. I know in Character Strong, the focus is on 80% of that community building has to happen in the first 2 weeks of every semester, or for those of you in elementary at the start of the year, coming back after those winter breaks. We have to front load a lot of this work. And when we do that, it gives us the time back to get to the academics. One great resource when we're talking about how is it we take what we've done within MTSS and that PBIS lens, and we bring in the mental health work, is the Interconnected Systems Framework. This resource is free. It's on pbis.org. The website is right there. That's our National PBIS Center. And it really details how do we start to get all of our clinicians and these outside agencies that are doing fantastic work to also align that work with all the fantastic things going on in schools, because we see that kids come in and maybe their school counselor is doing mentoring systems with the kid. They're running them through social skills development groups. And then that kid's leaving in the afternoon, and they may also be working with an outside counselor, and those things aren't connecting. So we're not really delivering a systematic framework for these kids. So this is about how do we bring things in to one place. And this entire manuscript is downloadable on the website. So it's about a couple of things. It's about structure. So we're thinking about how do we build this systems of processes, and that systems is about the adults and how the adults put in the right practices and supports and processes to affect the change that the kids need. This is one of the hardest parts, because the secret in all of this is adult change comes first and kid change comes second. And it's always a little bit harder to get the adults to change sometimes.
Never. It's never harder, Lori.
I know, right?
I tell people in all the roles that I have, the hardest part about my job is adult behavior change.
Yes. I know, we're so ingrained, because we've had our 40, 50, 60 years to learn all of our own behaviors.
Yeah.
The other big piece is then it's about who has authority at the highest level. So sometimes in a district, we're going all the way up to the superintendent role to really reallocate resources and change roles so that we can act in this interconnected manner.
And I just would jump in, if you haven't realized it already, which a lot of you have if you're on here, this work is about the restructure of how things have been done for so long. It is about the restructure. And I know that all three of us that are in schools all the time, we hear, well, we don't have the support here, or we don't have that resource. And that cannot be the way that we're thinking about this work. It has to be, how are we restructuring the process, reallocating different areas and pieces of support to create a system?
Yes. Yeah, I talk a lot about, I know right now you may not have that, but if you did, what would it look like, right? So we're always going to keep that optimistic view that we can make the change that's needed. And when we think about these bringing together our tier one at the mental health level, at our school systems level, this is about that basic prevention, right? So right now we're all washing our hands a lot, right? Because it's our universal precaution. It's the thing we're going to go back to again and again. It's going to keep us right now from getting sick. Same thing when we're bringing those systems together. It's about the first 6 weeks of school. You are teach, reteach, reinforce those school-wide expectations. What do we want to see from kids? What are the systems that allow the adults to help the kids meet those expectations? It's about bringing in our mental health partners. It's about doing screening for students to look for, are kids really getting the supports that they need? Are there additional supports? Because when we think back to that adverse childhood experience work, it could be that Bella has 7 of those ACEs, but because of her resilience, because of the protective factors in her life, she's doing okay, and she doesn't need a lot of other supports. I may have experienced one of those and my world could be falling apart because I don't have those protective factors. So we have to really be keeping our eye out for this whole child. What are all the things that might tell us that a student is struggling? So if you'll go to the next slide, thanks. And then we know if we can bring this together, right? This is, why is it that we're only getting to 80% of our kids? Sometimes we're not even seeing the mental health needs until they've really escalated. We know there's usually about a 6-year gap from the time that the first sign might be coming out until the time a kid gets into a true intervention. So we're trying to uncover that earlier, and we're trying to get kids rapidly into supports, because if I can start to address it early, I can prevent it from being chronic. My background is special education, working with students with emotional behavioral. And a lot of times I would see students coming in, qualifying in for services in middle school where I was working, that if we had really gotten to them when these things first started surfacing in elementary school, we could have prevented that need for such extreme services. And if you'll jump to the next slide. And this one comes, so from those of you who are joining us in Washington, right, this is our MTSS system. And if you go onto the OSPI website, you can see more about MTSS there for our state. But you can see again, this blending of how they've brought in the social emotional learning, those trauma-informed practices, the universal screening, all of those pieces that we want to do early at that tier 1 level. So then if we have kids that will need, so we think about this as all, some, and few. If we have some kids that need tier 2, we can get in and do that work well and try to keep that tier 3 number as few as possible for those kids. It's hard to do intensive needs services well in school. So we want to have as much prevention as we can. And then a final kind of look at this MTSS system, right? If we look at our kind of base level, we're bringing in at social emotional learning. This is where we're bringing in these pieces of Character Strong. And I know John's going to talk about some of these universal pieces, but it is things like weekly, are we doing the temperature checks with kids? Are we really putting out to our students, to our staff, to our families, all the different character dares? Are we taking advantage of that, 4 at the door plus 1 more, and that people know what that looks like? If we look at it, that mental health, this is about getting in and doing that prevention work, the early universal screenings. It's about teaching expectations at our PBIS level. And you may be bringing in other pieces like our restorative justice practices, which again should really focus 90% on prevention ahead of doing that intervention work. So you can see how this works at each tier.
Yeah, and last summer, so a lot of you actually maybe most of you don't know me. Usually when I present in Washington, some people know me, but probably you don't. My life's been crazy because, right, I have this 3-year-old. So for the last 3 years, it's been nuts. And this past summer, I've been wanting to create this visual for 3 years. And finally, this past summer, I was able to sit down and I had it in my mind and really put it together of when we think about MTSS and we think about our intensive supports going up the triangle, what does that look like in each of these foundational pieces of education? The social emotional learning, the mental health, the behavior side, and putting in restorative justice practices. So this is a snippet. If you want more information on any of these, obviously feel free to reach out to us. I could talk all day about this, but I won't. But what I will do is show you an incredible example in our state of a school district who is really, we've been on lots of different webinars with Medical Lake School District, and their information is at the bottom, the end of this PowerPoint. They've given me permission to give you permission to contact them if you have further questions. But this is a school district in where's Spokane? It's in the east. When you're from the East Coast, even if I've been here for a long time, you get confused with East and West. They're in the southeast part of our state.
Yes.
Yes, southeast part of Washington.
Bordering Idaho.
Bordering Idaho. So what they did was, just briefly, they saw the need to really come together as a school district and as a community to help reach out to the issues that they were having in their school district. They connected with the neighboring university to really help bring together this interconnected systems framework that Lori was telling you about. And every month they produce and distribute, every year, they produce every month, every year, they produce and distribute 7 Mind Your Health newsletters. And they go out email, they go out snail mail, they're shared with families, with community members, with kids, with educators. So everybody sees every month this Mind Your Health newsletter that focuses in on some very specific things. They also every month host a Mind Your Health education class for educators, for community, for families, for students, for everybody. So talk about tier 1 support and hitting it heavy. That's a really great model. These are the different things that they have focused on in the past. anything from food insecurity, exercise assessment, to drugs and alcohol, eating disorders, self-esteem, child abuse, mental health awareness. So along the spectrum, the topics that they're covering are really the most needed. And then it's kind of hard to see, but this isn't as important. They just talk through who are the different people that are presenting on these different topics. And again, they pull people from within their district, OTs, PTs, they pull clinicians from the neighboring university, people that have the expertise to be able to talk to everybody about these issues that they're seeing within their community. And then this is their breakdown of MTSS that includes mental health, social, emotional, and academics. So again, if you want more on this, you can email them at their emails at the end of this PowerPoint, and they have given permission for anybody to reach out. I think even England, so I think we'll be good. Okay, so really quick example, feel free to reach out if you want more. What I really want to push us into, I'm going to look at the time real quick, 10:30. Okay, we're doing good. The three most prevalent mental health challenges that we see in school, executive functioning challenges, depression, and anxiety. And if we were in a full 2 days of this training, I would go really in depth with all of these, but I'm not going to. What I will mention though is everybody on this call, I think there's like 250 people on this call right now. Every single one of you have seen every single one of these show up in your buildings, in your classrooms. Let me just talk a little bit more about this. When we say executive functioning challenges, just in brief, we're really talking about the part of our brain that houses, I tell kids when they're in my office, it's the boss of our brain. It really houses all of those foundational skills that we need to really be able to plan and to organize, to regulate our emotions, to think about the bigger picture, that metacognition. There's about 9 different domains of executive functioning. And if one of those domains is off, it can absolutely affect everything else in its path. And so really thinking about, a lot of times what you'll hear in schools is ADHD or ADD. That is a piece of executive functioning, but again, there are 9 different domains within that. So I wanted to just use a broader executive functioning term versus ADHD or ADD, but you have seen this in your buildings. You've also seen depression, you've also seen anxiety. And the way that these 3 manifest themselves can look so different in every single kid. And that's what makes it pretty challenging. So when I do a full day on this, I really can break down what does it look like, what does it sound like, what each of these are. But if you want more information on this, there's resources at the end on any of these that you can look into, getting small resources for your classroom, for your building that really addresses each of these. The thing that I think we miss the most in schools, we can run groups that can hit kids who are feeling a little sad. We can run groups that hit kids who are feeling a little anxious. We miss so much of the time supporting kids with executive functioning challenges. And so really being able to focus in on those challenges, and for sure, those executive functioning challenges that kids are facing will lead into depression, will lead into the anxiety that kids feel. So all of these are important, but when I look at every kid that I see and every kid that I've ever seen, how can we lean into and tap into those executive functioning pieces? Because if I can't regulate my emotions, I'm not going to be able to get at the depression, I'm not going to be able to get at the anxiety that I'm feeling. So
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Because I saw a little chat come up from our good friend, Dr. Gloria Mitchell, who's on the call with us. And she was saying too, we're just seeing so much of the impacts of the trauma right now on the adults and how it's impacting, adults are losing friends and loved ones with this virus. They're so impacted in their ability then to take care of the students, their own children.
Yes.
And just thinking about too how that affects, as adults, our own executive functioning right now is very challenged because of the trauma we're experiencing through this.
Yes. Lori and I did a webinar yesterday with one of our good colleagues at Northwest PBIS. She's the executive director, Dr. Jessica Swain-Bradway. And we started off the webinar with exactly getting at what Lori just said. We asked the question, how are you doing? And we broke everybody up into rooms. And everyone in my room said how they're doing in their job and how they're managing their job. And so I listened to everybody, and then I said, okay, now tell me how you're doing. I want to know how you are doing, because this is really hard and this is really challenging and people are going through a lot right now. So talk to me about your emotional state. And once I opened that up, people talked, and it was really great to be able to hear people say and feel safe enough to hear people say, this is really challenging. I'm on edge. Everything seems way bigger than it typically would. So I'm telling every educator, and I know Lori is too, when we're on coaching calls, what are you doing intentionally as staff in your building right now to connect with the rest of your staff and really have these honest conversations? That's mental health, and that's taking care of mental health. Mm-hmm. So thinking about these prevalent challenges that show up in schools and just taking a little bit of a toe dip into how do we address the needs of those mental health challenges? It really comes down to one thing. It's teaching emotional intelligence. I know it's the hidden driver to success. Lori knows that, John knows that, but not a lot of people do know that or feel comfortable with that. But really, this work that we're going to dive into around supporting mental health, it's helping to support teaching the emotional intelligence, the capacity of our children. Daniel Goleman, if you don't know him, he's done a ton of work on emotional intelligence, and I've studied him for a long time. But we know from his work that science now shows that emotional intelligence enhances young minds in their capacity to integrate skills, attitudes, behaviors effectively into daily tasks and challenges. So if we don't have a strong sense of emotional intelligence, we're going to struggle in school. Emotional intelligence is learned, which is great. That means it's learnable. So you think about this idea, and he talks about neuroplasticity, and we just talked about, of all the work that we do, that I do, working with adults is the hardest part. And that the reason is because that neuroplasticity, I just turned 40 a couple weeks ago. I've had 40 years of neural pathways built in a specific direction. I like to think that I can be flexible and unlearn things. If you ask my husband, he may say something different, but I like to think that I can be flexible and learn new things. But I'm in this all the time, and I'm really aware, I'm thinking about this all the time. When you're not in this, when this isn't your comfort zone, trying to create that neuroplasticity, those changes in neural pathways can be very difficult over 40, 50, 60 years, right? So it sometimes is a slow process. And I was just on a call with someone recently about, I don't remember who it was, but how do we get, now that we're all online learning, how do we get teachers that didn't feel comfortable in the beginning, right, connecting with kids on this relational level? How do we get them now even harder over Zoom, over the computer? How does that work? And what tools can we give our teachers to be able to lean into that a little bit more? The bottom line is, what you engage in social emotional learning, you are teaching emotional intelligence. You are broadening the capacity of a kid's emotional intelligence. And imagine over years of being in school, the effect that you can have not only on that kid, but on that kid's future and on our society. And I'm going to tell you, and I can say this because I have seen kids and their families for a really long time. Most of the time, this is not happening in homes. It's not. So where is a better place? There's not a better place in my mind. There's not a better place to teach this than in schools. Mm-hmm. When we think about emotional intelligence, this last piece, you're really teaching cognitive control, and Goleman calls this grit. When you go into schools and you see their universal tier 1 expectations, and grit is one of them, that is emotional intelligence. That is teaching cognitive control. And then there's some really great, I love this analogy of putting kids in the mental health gym to help strengthen their prefrontal cortex. I don't think I mentioned prefrontal cortex, but that's where all of your executive functioning skills are housed. in your prefrontal cortex, the boss of your brain. So if you take kids 4 to 8 and you measure abilities of cognitive control, you pick them back up in their 30s, it predicts their financial success, health, and health better than IQ and wealth of family that they grew up in. That is some powerful data. So again, from my perspective, why would we not be doing this in schools?
Well, and I would jump in and add one of the school district I was working with 2 weeks ago, who, in a more affluent area in Washington, they have a very high graduation rate. A lot of their kids are going on to post-secondary colleges, but when they're doing the follow-up data, a lot of their kids are also not staying in college because of the lack of social emotional learning skills.
Yes.
Right. And so not only does this protect us for our mental health, but it really helps us to guarantee that future academic success. So when people say, why should I spend time teaching SEL? It's like, well, without it, the academics are just lost.
Yeah, and if you have been in a presentation with me, I just really love stories, and Lori knows that gets me into trouble because then I talk too much, but I just have to share this story really quick. I was working with a school, or I am working with a school district here in Washington, and it's, again, a very affluent area in a part of our state, and we're really working on setting the foundations at their high school for Tier 1, and their principal has pushed back. We don't need this. We don't need to be focused. Our kids are fine. We don't need to be focusing on this. This year alone, within a 6-month span, they had 4 kids die by suicide. So you cannot tell me, no matter where you are, you will never convince me that no kid needs this work. Every kid needs this work. Every single kid. I get real passionate about that and spicy. And so, of course, after the fact, because that's what we do oftentimes, is that we're much more reactive than preventative. After the fact, he calls and says, okay, what do we need to do, right? And the hard part is we've lost 4 lives because we weren't able to think preventatively. Okay, so now diving into, in the last part of our webinar, our Tier 1 foundational strategies. John's going to start you off with that, and then I'll finish us out with some higher level supports.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and I've got over 2 pages of notes here, and I just want to say once again, thank you for. I mean, they're just watching the chat. I love the awareness piece, and I love how we really zeroed in on that. As much as these may seem like, if I'm showing up to this webinar, like things that I've heard before, many do not know this, and we need to keep bringing awareness to this, because I think when the awareness is brought forward, it's really hard not to put an area of focus on this. And I think, Bella, when you say the stories, yes, sometimes we go long, but we're wired for story, and stories are what we remember. There'll be people that's what they remember coming out of this. Like, we can't wait on our kids. We need to do this work. I think Dominic Randolph in the Riverdale School District near New York City, which is one of the most affluent in the country, says that he has many fragile thoroughbreds, students who are going on to Ivy League schools on a consistent basis, right? But as Dr. Linus said, they don't stay in there in many cases, or they struggle in many different areas because it's perform at the first sign of adversity, in many cases crumble like a ton of bricks. And so who needs this work? Everybody. And so when it comes to that, the area that I'll just briefly touch on is, no matter what we're doing in that system of supports, so many times when I was both as a high school teacher and then at the district level, is it would be, here's a problem that I don't know how to handle, right? Whether it's behavior or a student or whatever it might be. And it's like Tier 2. I need help, Tier 3. Somebody deal with this student. I don't know what to do, Tier 2, Tier 3. And really it's a cry for help of, I don't know what to do. I don't necessarily have the skills or whatever else it might be. And what happens is, when you go in to take a look, what is always going to be needed for a Tier 2 intervention to work? Well, a strong Tier 1 foundation. And the number of times that Tier 1 foundation was missing is alarming. Mm-hmm. So how do you have that kind of conversation? Well, we could do one, but it's not going to work, because we actually have to work on the foundation first, That's not an easy conversation to have. And so you do your best, you support, you try the tier 2 intervention. Did it work? Didn't work. Could have called it, but that goes to this idea that we have to be always all in on strengthening the foundation so that everything else that we're trying to do can actually have a better chance of working. And so when we talk about the key to change, we always talk about the adult work first. It begins with the adults, the adult relational work, and knowing that we've got so many different tools at our disposal. I remember at the district level, we were teaching the 16 proactive classroom management strategies, and they're all great. But once the gauntlet starts and I'm actually in the work, it's like, phew, I lose it. And so what if we zeroed in as a staff on a smaller number of tier 1 relational strategies to leverage that relational work from the adults in the building to students, that we could get fidelity in, that is ultimately in the big picture, low burden, and that's important, with the opportunity of high impact. We call that low-high, low burden, high impact, and here's what they are. We call it our SERVE model, start intentionally. The staple practice is 4 at the door plus 1 more. I won't go in depth. We talk about it at our trainings, but it's not just standing at the door. It's how we do it. It's the intentionality of how we greet students. And it's when students come in that there is something ready for them to do that has been explicitly taught, like an entry task process that has been built into the routine. If you expect it, pre-correct it. I think, as Anita Archer always says, you have to keep teaching to it and don't expect that they know. That when we do that consistently, on average, 20% more academic engaged time in an average hour-long class. 20% more AET, academic engaged time, is very high leverage and much different than time dedicated to instruction. And I know at the high school level, many times I thought I had engagement and I didn't. I had time dedicated to instruction. So how do we get that actual engagement? I also know that 4 at the door plus 1 more is one of the #1 safety moves that we can make as a school. More eyes in the hallway seeing things before they potentially escalate or whatever else it might be. To quickly go through this, #2 is engage relationally. The dosage of this would be once a week. At least once a week as a staff, intentionally work into your entry task a simple temperature check. To speak to the adult part, Bella and Lori, you were speaking to it randomly during COVID-19. I started doing some, like at 9 p.m. Pacific time, like Facebook Live on this same like Character Strong Educator page. And it was just at the time, like to let people know what was going on. And there's a crew of people now 30, 40 strong who like every night or every other night when we jump on, literally just look forward to that like coming together, even though we're not actually physically in person. They just want to check in. And we always start every one of them with a quick temperature check on a scale of 1 to 5. How are you doing? And even just the space to put it in there and the option of putting Y if they want to, which is what this move is for staff. It's required that they put their name. It's required on a scale of 1 to 5. How are you doing? But optional is Y. And what if we proactively could be finding out information versus waiting until it maybe bubbles over, right? Or we didn't see that coming because it's an internalizing behavior that wasn't as noticeable. What if we actually could get a pulse on that? The third part is respond with empathy. It's the prompt method. Dr. Diana Browning Wright, Dr. Clayton Cook talk about this a lot, but the prompt method is a progressive response to dealing with low-level behavior that really is rooted in empathy. I always talk about the first two. What if we just got better at proximity control and redirection strategies? The studies would say, the research would say that up to 70 to 85% of low-level behavior can be addressed just by getting consistency with those two actions as a staff. The next part is values practice consistently, and it's the use of putting in front, especially secondary students, ideas. It's really about the character dare process, putting ideas of what it looks like to put social emotional learning and character development into action, and then giving them a space to either speak their truth. What do they think about it? We call it the truth or dare process. They don't have to do it. Sometimes just considering the dare is the dare itself. Either speak your truth or reflect on your experience with it. And giving that space to discuss. Now, having done multiple fidelity checks in schools and districts, here's what we've learned. Students will tell you, both middle and high school, random surveys when you come into a building, that conversation is incredibly important. We don't have enough of these types of conversations. Really what they're saying is just that we want to check in. How's it going? And we can use that through the lens of a specific kind of challenge for the week. Staff will say, well, I didn't know if I should do it because I didn't know if my students would be into it. And so you got two different messages. You got students saying, we do want to do it, and it is important. You got staff saying, I don't know if I'm comfortable with it, which goes back to the adult work. We have to do the adult work first. The biggest cost in many cases is comfort. Comfort of our staff to get used to this. That's why we have to pour into that readiness work. The final part is exit intentionally. And the dosage on this one is once a month, and it's the EMR strategy. If you're elementary, it's take your class roster. If it's a secondary, maybe start with one. Maybe it's your toughest class, and do a simple reflection exercise. Next to each name, put either an E, which means I'm still establishing a relationship with that student, an M, I'm maintaining, that's the ideal, but it's still going to take work. And then R is I'm in need of restoring of that relationship with that student. And in the practice profile that we provide, there are then strategies for each of those E, M, and R, and that simple reflection of where I'm at with each of the relationships with my students, and then setting some intentional goals over that next month or week or whatever time period to then go to work on restoring, go to work on establishing with that smaller group of students who need it most, can be incredibly powerful. So here's an example of what if we really zeroed in on 5 kind of tier 1 relational strategies as a staff. What kind of impact would we then see on the greater tier 1 foundational supports?
Okay. My screen is not, there we go. Okay. There are so many places that we could go with giving supports, but when we think about tier 2 strategies now, one of your most robust strategies at tier 2 is going to be check in, check out. And I love talking about putting a mental health focus in on check in, check out. I'm not going to go into detail on what check in, check out is, but basically, if you don't know, just go to one of the resources at the end of the page or the end of the PowerPoint, and you can see that a little bit more. But basically, we are creating intentional space around connecting with kids on some specific targets. And we're doing that several times throughout the day. We're greeting them at the beginning of the day intentionally to start off the day in a positive way. And then we're checking in with them once, maybe twice throughout the day, and then checking out with them. And we've got a real strong parent component. But when we add in that mental health focus, and I've got some real specific daily progress reports, DPRs, if you want to see some, just email me, that really focus in on levels of anxiety and connected to the skills that we're teaching kids. So if I'm teaching a kid a 5-point scale around anxiety, and we're really wanting that kid to be able to recognize when they're at a 3 on that 5-point scale or a 2 on that 5-point scale, my check in, check out mental health focus will be, was I able to do that? Was I able to recognize that I was at a 2 or a 3? And if so, was I able to use the skills that we've learned to help bring myself back down? So you can do some real intentional work with this specific intervention itself from a mental health focus. Another key piece for some targeted support, the most evidence-based practice that we use as clinicians is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. I use it all the time. I do groups with this. I do individual sessions with kids with this all the time. And it's really helping to shift the thoughts, behaviors, and actions of an individual. And I saw, one of the comments I saw was from a para that said, how do I as a para in my position use some of this, leverage some of this to be able to give to kids in my role? I'm not going to go into how you can do this at tier 1 in this webinar, but I'm just feeling like maybe we should do another one and we can go a little bit deeper into that because there are things that you could learn in 45 minutes with me. You don't need to be a clinician, and you can bring that into a classroom. And I just think, imagine if every teacher was focusing tier 1 on how to change thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, what a profound effect it could have on a school. So I've got that for you. I don't remember your name, but I can help you with that. But really focusing in on, in our groups at tier 2, I've trained school district, like I said, counselors or just different social works, different kind of people on how we bring CBT into our buildings. How do we do that in an effective way? First, we've got to teach everybody about it, because when you go through an education program, you don't get training on CBT as a counselor, you don't. I happen to have it because I got a doctorate and my focus was on counseling psychology. But as a school counselor, I did not get that training. So how do we bring that information into schools to give to folks who are in the position to be able to deliver these methods to our students? CBT, again, the most evidence-based practice. So how do we do that in a group setting? But then also, how do we do that in a more individualized setting as well? And that kind of brings me to my last tier 3 individualized strategies. How are we using these things like CBT? Another one is DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. Another one is ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. How are we using the strategies as educators from those tenets to bring into our buildings to address the mental health piece with our kids? And the tier 3 individualized, that would be more like someone like me in a building. And when we think about solution-focused counseling, it's brief in duration, 1 to 5 meetings, but really meant to dive right in at the challenged thinking and doing some work around that to think a little bit differently. Because we know in CBT, if you can think differently, you can recognize the thought and you can think differently, you're gonna feel differently, which means you can do something different. So there is your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 snippet. Here are some great resources. Go to Amazon, they're cheap. These are resources that I use all the time in my practice, just pull from different places. I'm working with a high school right now in Eastern Washington. They were gonna pilot it this spring. That didn't work out, so we're gonna do it now in the fall. We're going to use the CBT Foundation. They've created a class for credit that a teacher is teaching, and I'm teaching that teacher how to do this. We're putting it together, but they're and it's an alternative high school. So they are offering credit for this class to learn about CBT and thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So here are your secondary resources. Some of my favorites. Here are your elementary resources. Some of my favorites. This CBT toolbox, oh, it's so good. That's like one of the best ones on here. They're all good, but that's a really good one. And then coping skills, workbook for kids. You've got a kid that's really anxious, what to do when you worry too much. Really good things that you can focus on in delivering this work. And then I've got lots of different resources here at the end that you can explore on your own to look into these elements that we've talked through. Okay, let's see, did we do it? What time is it?
You did great.
We did it.
Do you have a couple more minutes that we could do rapid fire? And maybe Laura, you've got like some other comments there to end, and then I'm queued up and I could do some rapid fire with you and see for those that want to stay. We still have 213 that are staying with us live. And I know maybe they could all benefit from some of those questions, but we've kept them all on the
happy to do questions, yeah.
Perfect. I've been doing my best too, so that people know. I know that there were some questions about like, resources of like pulling off to the side, so that in the follow-up email that we include as many of these as possible. And so let us know if there's something that you really are hoping that is in that. I'm also, just so you have it right now, I'm putting in the chat both Dr. Bukowski and Dr. Linus's email information right here, just so you have it right now in the moment. And so feel free to reach out to them. But here's some rapid fire, so you could decide who wants to take them, and we'll try to do it like, if it feels like it's going to take a longer answer, then maybe direct, like, hey, that'd be a good webinar, or here's where you can go for more, because there's a few questions. So here's the first one. Are you seeing more cases of bipolar disorders? We are hearing more in our district.
I will say that yes. However, that's a harder question to answer because there's so many things that come before that haven't been addressed. So yes, for sure, I am seeing that in my practice, but I don't know that I always agree when a kid comes in with a diagnosis of bipolar. I don't know that I agree that that actually is the diagnosis after I do some digging.
Yeah, I think we're getting better at recognizing some of that too than we have in the past. It's
important. How about this? We're hearing a lot lately about Zoom fatigue. What are your recommendations regarding that?
You know, this is funny because one of our colleagues sent us an
Yes.
article yesterday about this too. And I know I'm exhausted at the end of the day when I get off of these, because it's a lot of sensory input. You're looking at yourself. I mean, you're talking and then your picture's up the whole time. There's some true things with this, and there's a lot of recommendations to try to build in blocks for yourself. Walk away, get outside if you can get out for even a 5 or 10 minute walk, you know, walk up and down the street, but taking some screen breaks, because it's a lot of sensory input for our brains all day.
And remembering that with our kids too. I've got some schools who've got such crazy expectations for kids to be on a screen for 4.5 hours a day. That does not match up or line up with any of the research. So really taking these considerations for us as adults, but also for kids as well.
So good. And I'm gonna too, I'll throw in some different comments as well, because I think they're important. We're trying to capture as many as we can. Someone that just said, this is the very best webinar I've listened to over the past month. Thank you so much for sharing all of your outstanding experience, expertise, and advice. This was so powerful. 3 exclamation points.
Thank you.
So I thought that was cool.
Thank you.
I love the practical nature of that, right? Like our calendar many times drives our lives. We had Dr. Jen McCauley, who's up in Seattle, works a lot more with like kind of business leadership, coaching, and even just that idea of when we talk about our to-be list versus our to-do list, right? And a lot of times it's just our to-do list. So it's our Zoom meetings and all the things, but like, what if we started to add into that the who I want to be list, which might even be, I want to be healthy, so I need to move, right? I want to be someone who is doing blank. I want to write this card, something that gets me away from that. And I always love the practical idea of when someone asks, hey, can you meet at 2? And at 2 o'clock, I put one of my to-be list that I can just say, sorry, I've already got something at that time.
Yeah.
They don't ask, well, what do you have? Like people don't ask that question.
Yes.
So I think that that's super practical and a great recommendation. How about this? If we are, this is kind of going in order a little bit of like going back to the beginning, but if we're to accept the responsibility of serving our 80% of learners at various levels of need, how then do we bring enough information to all staff to be of support to decrease this number? Maybe a bigger question, but thoughts on that, on the rapid fire round.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this too probably gets in at that staff buy-in.
Yes.
And it's so much of this starts with awareness. So are your staff even really aware of your kind of PBIS, MTSS structures, the benefits of doing those? Do they really understand behavior and why you're seeing behavior in kids? Because I think once we have that understanding, and it's, you know, this child's not trying to be difficult or evil or any of these other things we might say about kids, that they're really struggling to meet their needs. I know someone had put in a question about what about kids who don't seem like they want the help?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, protective factor, if they have, been abused, if they have not had successful relationships with adults, they will seem like they're pushing us away, but you've got to dig under that layer. So I think so much of this is building awareness.
And the hard part about that is that just takes time.
Yep.
Yeah.
That just takes time. And you know, just to add to that, I would also say as leaders in the building, it's creating that buy-in. What are the messages that you're sending about priorities in our building, goals in our building? And is this, if you had to put an overlay over it, is this culture and climate a part of that? And do we talk about it more than just once in August when we come back?
Right.
Is it a part of our every day, our every month? Is it something that we are not just saying, but we're actually breathing and doing?
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of my background is in that like organizational leadership work. That's what I got my master's degree in. And more than once in this webinar, I've heard the importance of quality leadership. And I think a lot of times our building principals get a lot of what I would say is in the manager side. We manage things,
Yes.
We lead people. And they get a lot of training on the managing side. How do I evaluate? How do I set the schedule? All those things. But what about actually leading people, like learning to identify and meet the legitimate needs? Well, if I'm doing that, then we have to put an area of focus here.
Yes.
But a lot of times it's like, well, I've got all these things. How do I navigate them? Well, if I'm not learning to navigate and put in front what's most important and make time for that, then we're going to continue to see the results that we're seeing. And so there has to be a change. And that part is so critical I'm going to keep it rapid fire. How about this? We have a lot of interventions in place. We're at a point where we need to hone in and focus on what is working. What are some ways to measure the impact of what we're doing and if it's working?
Yeah.
Next webinar. Next webinar. We can add that in the next webinar because there's a few different ways that we could go.
I like that. And that's a good rapid fire answer. And Krista, if you would on our team, make note of that. And so we can, in fact, before some people jump on, we still have a good crew still here. So we'll stay with you for a moment. May 11th is the next one that we have. You might even direct Bella and Lori to any others that you may have, but I know we're doing another one. I think it's May 11th that people can register for, sign up for, and we'll continue this conversation. Here is a question. Can you send that link to see this, the Washington MTSS? I think that was the OSPI. I put that as a note. We'll attach that in the follow-up email for sure.
I also stuck in here a little thing, Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. So it says Northwest MHTTC. We're starting a 3-part webinar series. It's free. It starts Thursday for administrators on building systems for staff and students returning from COVID-19. So a lot of these resources for admin will be on there.
So good. Okay, here's interesting. It says, what about rational intelligence? Why are we talking about just emotional intelligence? Aren't we supposed to use more rational reasoning, not driven by emotions all the time? Emotions need to be controlled.
CBT, next training, CBT. I'll teach you all about that.
Good.
That's exactly what you're talking about.
This is good. I love it. All right. So it says, can you address the, in quote, old school mentality of older staff? For example, we didn't have to be taught to be resilient, or the idea that we are making kids worse by diving into their issues at school. I had some staff last year that felt this way. How do we get them on board? Obviously, how do we get them on board? We have to make time for that, which is most important. We need to keep diving into that. But just any thoughts on that?
I think the single best way that you can help shift mindsets, put the adults in the position that we're wanting kids to be in. Put them in the position to feel what it is that we're doing. I'll tell you, I could give you lots of stories about 60-year-old men and women who I have in tears because I was able to put them in the position of doing what we're asking kids to do, and then they got it.
Yeah.
And I put one quick resource up there. It's the Staff Perceptions of Behavior and Discipline Survey. It's run out of the University of Washington. It's a free school survey that staff, and it helps them dig into some of those perceptions around behavior that then you can address.
Can you say that one more time, Dr. Linus, and then Krista will make sure that we include it.
And I put it in the chat too. It's Staff Perceptions of Behavior and Discipline Survey. If you put that in the search, you'd find it.
Awesome.
SPBD, and it's one of our colleagues at University of Washington, and there's a lot of good stuff that can come out of that.
That's great. You know, it just kind of came to mind, and I don't know why I hadn't thought of this before, but when you say like putting adults into the position, right? I think a lot of adults right now are experiencing that.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like this, like, I don't know how to do this, and it's overwhelming. And so even just clicking sometimes in a Google Doc is bringing me to tears. Well, let's put ourselves in the shoe. That's how some students feel every single day just being at school.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that empathy piece sometimes, and not that everybody is in that way and has an experience, but there are many right now who they're experiencing in many ways a look in some way at what some students feel like every single day in school.
Yes.
And so how do we function when we're trying to balance so many million things and don't know everything that we're supposed to be, you know, all of that. So I think that's a great reminder of let's put ourselves in those shoes. And sometimes what if we could? Let's see. Are there any plans to have any seminars on Zoom that could help get the adults more comfortable working with the kids at risk in a better way now that everyone is online? I think absolutely we can talk about that more in the follow-up. We also could be looking at, that's one of the #1 problems is that, like I always say, the biggest cost is comfort. What are some ways that we could do? And maybe there's even a series that we could do over this time while we're away and so many more people are engaged. I mean, the webinar numbers have been triple what they normally are because people can engage right now more content, which is great. Let's see, a couple more. Someone said, I'd like to make sure that I'm on the email list for like the next webinar. How do we do that? They can do that on our site. They could also email us, info@characterstrong.com. And the team, if you want to just be on all of them, can just tag you so that you get registered automatically. So
we'll be doing a virtual conference in August that will go much more in depth of these topics, for sure, this topic. So email us if you're interested in that as well.
Mhm.
Perfect. And once again, if you didn't get it when we first put it in there, we'll include that in the follow-up
Yeah.
email. Do you already have the information on that we could include in the follow-up email?
We
Or is
don't
it
have
coming out
all
soon?
of the sessions outlined yet. We're wrapping that up this week.
Okay,
Yes.
so coming soon. Okay,
Yes.
that's perfect. Let me just pick a couple of the final ones. Are there any? Let's see. I think that's pretty much, I mean, that a lot of them are very similar. Let me just end with a couple final comments. I'd love to have more in-depth trainings on this. I think we've been addressing that and where they can get more. Someone said, thank you for mentioning that. It was something earlier in the webinar. The first few weeks, I felt that I was keeping super busy with work and starting to feel burnout. Then in my own life, I would feel sad and not engaged with my family. Last week, I decided to take time for myself, get back on my schedule with workouts. After a week of this, I'm feeling much stronger.
Hey.
Patience, right?
E-list, right?
Oh, good. Yes, I think it, and it says, I think it needs to be addressed that educators are overwhelmed with
Yep.
what schools are more and more being asked to do while children live in poverty and families who offer little to no emotional support. And I think we always preach it very hard, like we have to do the adult work first. And that doesn't mean that adults need to change and that's the work. No, we need to do the adult SEL work first. We got to take care of each other so that we can better serve the students as well. And so let's not mistake that message. We are called to serve students, but we also need to lead our adults well and be taking care of them, because I would say, who needs this work? It's not just our students.
No.
Right? I love the question at the beginning of a train, like raise your hand if you know an adult in your life who struggles to manage certain emotions like
Yes.
anger. Right? Raise your hand if you know someone who's an adult who has the basic competencies of school down, like reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? But they struggle to maintain positive relationships in their life. Every hand is up in the room. This is not just for kids. This is as much for adults.
Yeah.
I think that's it. You know what? This has been phenomenal. We had over 200 something people live on Zoom. I don't know how many we had on Facebook. I'll have to go back over, but so grateful for you.
Yes.
Thank
Bella
you.
and Lori for the work that you do. Any final words? Obviously, we're going to make sure that people know how they can connect with you. There's lots of people saying thank you in the chat. Any final words?
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I have a kid that I have to see right now, so I'm going to have to sign off, but thank you so
Me
much
too.
for taking the
Sounds
time
good.
to be here.
Appreciate you both. Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thanks,
Take
Lori.
care. Everyone take care and exercise. It's good for your mental health.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye, guys.